This episode is brought to you by Ground News, the world's first ever news comparison platform. Anybody who consumes the news these days knows that it's an imperfect system. No kidding. Gone are the days of quiet, passionate journalists who tell it like it is. In today's increasingly loud news environment, it's harder than ever to tell sense from nonsense. Thankfully, there's Ground News, a helpful app designed by media outsiders that is dedicated to fighting misinformation and biased news coverage. Tired of one-sided news coverage? Well, cut through the bias and the BS using Ground News' popular aggregate feed, which pulls together stories from more than 50,000 sources all across the ideological spectrum. Ground News allows you to filter news by political leaning, so you could jump into the app and see the same story brought to you by a left-wing, a center, or a right-wing news source. Oftentimes, you might see a story that is sensationalized by the left or might be overblown by the right. Either way, having the ability to see the entire news ecosystem in one place is brilliant contextual ability that you didn't even know you needed. Ground News also has a popular feature called News Blind Spot that readers from across the political spectrum like. Ever wonder if you're missing a story because it's not showing up in your own little political echo chamber? Well, you're not going to miss it with Ground News because it doesn't just show stories from multiple perspectives, it shows you which ideological groups are covering or ignoring certain stories. Learn more and try it for yourself by downloading the free Ground News app or clicking the link in the description below, and let's get into the video. During Frank Costello's trial, his lawyers advised him that he should stop dressing in expensive suits that cost hundreds of dollars and instead wear more regular stuff off the rack to make himself look more relatable. He replied, "I'm sorry, counselor, but I'd rather blow the goddamn case." That's the kind of man Frank Costello was. He was always careful to look his best, and he liked to spend his time with a better class of people. For some mobsters, this meant rubbing elbows with movie stars and other Hollywood big shots. For Costello, this meant the world of politics. It has been said that no other crime boss had more politicians and judges in their pocket. Costello saw them as an invaluable resource, so he always made sure to do them favors, raise money for their campaigns, and increase their voter turnout. Of course, in return, they all owed him, and Costello always intended to collect at the most opportune time. Due to his ever-growing spider web of political connections, Frank Costello has been nicknamed the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and today we will take a look at his criminal career, from his beginnings as a petty thief to his rise as boss of the most powerful family in the Mafia, to his violent downfall. Frank Costello was born Francesco Castiglia on January 26, 1891, in a tiny hamlet called Lorapoli in the Italian region of Calabria. He was the youngest child of Luigi and Maria Castiglia, who also had an older son and 4 daughters. As prospects weren't looking too good for the family in Calabria, Luigi decided to do the same thing as countless other Italians. In 1895, he took some of his older children and traveled to America in search of a better life, planning to send for the rest of his family once he was settled. Just a few months later, Maria Castiglia sold everything she owned in Calabria and boarded a ship for New York, accompanied by her youngest offspring, including the 4-year-old Francesco. The family lived in East Harlem, in an area that was known back then as Little Italy due to its large population of Italian immigrants, although we should mention that it is not the same as the Little Italy of today. Luigi worked as a laborer while Maria opened a store selling traditional Italian products. Back then, the National Crime Syndicate was still a long way away, but local crime bosses still existed who mainly controlled the rackets within an individual neighborhood. Frank Costello's first experience with the criminal underworld may have been a woman named Pasquarella Spinelli. She operated a horse stable near where the Costellos lived, but she mainly used it as a front for buying and selling stolen horses. An urban myth also said that she allowed other criminals to bury their victims on her property, which is why the place became known as the murder stable in local law. There's nothing to suggest that young Frank ever worked for her, just that he witnessed a lot of the dealings that went on in there. Costello himself turned to crime when he was just a teenager, starting out small with petty theft. He first got into trouble with the law in 1908 when he was arrested trying to extort a local merchant, but the charges were dismissed. He was then arrested in 1912, but again faced no serious consequences. It wasn't until 1915 that Costello's luck finally ran out, and the 24-year-old served almost a year in prison for carrying a concealed gun. From that point on, Costello rarely carried a weapon on him. Over the decades, he would develop a reputation of being a relatively amicable man, at least in his line of work, and it is uncertain if he ever actually killed anyone. Costello preferred to achieve his goals through corruption and influence, but it would be a rather generous stretch to call him peaceful. He was still involved, one way or another, in numerous violent acts. If he truly never got his hands dirty, that was only because he was surrounded by others who would do it for him. Anyway, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. For now, Frank Costello was still just a petty criminal in his early 20s. He was working for a gang led by a man named Morello, and that was when he met his future partners, who would help him revolutionize organized crime in America. They were Lucky Luciano and Mayor Lansky. The arrival of Prohibition was a giant boon for all criminals in America. Like many others, Costello became involved in bootlegging, although he ran other rackets such as gambling and extortion on the side. Already Costello was displaying his predilection for building contacts and relationships with the people on the other side of the law, so while his partners were busy handling their operations, Costello's main responsibility was greasing all the right palms to make sure that everyone was paid and happy. Their biggest problems came from some of their bosses, who were stuck in the old ways of doing things. The Calabrians didn't think Costello should be doing business with a Sicilian like Luciano or vice versa, let alone both of them working with the Jewish and Irish gangs. In the late 1920s, the formation of the National Crime Syndicate helped smooth over somewhat the working relationships between the multi-ethnic criminal organizations, but the American Mafia was still in turmoil due to several people vying for the position of capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. This was resolved in 1931 during the Castelmarese War, a pivotal moment in American crime history that led to the formation of the Commission. Now, we've already talked about the Castelmarese War in detail in our bios for Mayor Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, since their gang members were used as hitmen to take out the former bosses. If you haven't seen those videos, maybe give them a watch, but, well, here's the Cliff Notes version. Two bosses, Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, were fighting to become the boss of all bosses. They were both betrayed by Costello, Luciano, and the rest of the younger mobsters who wanted a more modern and equitable way of handling things instead of always having one man at the top. First, Masseria was killed, then Maranzano a few months later. Afterwards, Lucky Luciano and all the other important mobsters held a meeting where they formed the Commission, a ruling body that oversaw all mafia activities in the country and mediated conflicts. The Commission had a board of directors which consisted of the 7 most powerful Italian families in the country, the 5 New York families, plus the Buffalo crime family and the Chicago outfit run by Al Capone. All the other ones were represented in the Commission by one of the 7 acting as their intermediary. Unsurprisingly, the Luciano crime family was their biggest and most powerful of all. It was run by Lucky Luciano himself, obviously, while a man named Vincenzo Genovese served as underboss, and his trusted ally, Frank Costello, was his new consigliere. During his time as consigliere, Costello ran multiple rackets that turned him into one of the mafia's best earners, but none were more profitable than his slot machine business. At its peak, he had around 25,000 machines in New York and its surrounding states. Technically, they were classified as candy machines, since they would dispense a mint on a losing pull. It was a good grift, but it only lasted for a couple of years. In 1934, Florello LaGuardia was elected as the new mayor of New York City on an anti-corruption platform, and he declared war on slot machines by literally having them smashed to bits and thrown into the Long Island Sound. It was a heavy blow for Costello, but he made up for it somewhat by securing a new deal to bring the slot machines to Louisiana. A much bigger blow for Costello and the whole family came in 1936 when Lucky Luciano was convicted of running a prostitution ring and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. His underboss, Vito Genovese, became the acting boss, but just a year later he had to flee to Italy to avoid a murder indictment. Therefore, Frank Costello was now head of the Luciano crime family, even though Lucky still gave orders from behind bars. This arrangement worked for a while. Costello was involved in a lot of different rackets with other mobsters, mainly in gambling and bookmaking operations with the likes of Mayor Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Tony Accardo. He proved to be invaluable as a partner in such businesses due to his ever-growing network of political connections. It has often been said, though not definitively proven, that Costello even had J. Edgar Hoover in his pocket, which was why Hoover denied the existence of the mafia for decades. How exactly Costello achieved this is still a juicy bit of mafia lore. Hoover liked to bet on horses, although he always claimed he never put down more than $2 on a single race. However, according to rumors, Costello would give him tips on fixed races, and Hoover would use agents to place large bets on his behalf. That is the most common version of the story, although a much more salacious rumor stated that Costello and Mayor Lansky had incriminating photographs of Hoover engaged in homosexual activity. On the inside, Luciano was still hopeful for an early release, and his opportunity presented itself when the United States entered World War II. In February 1942, the SS Normandy caught fire and capsized while docked at New York's Pier 88. The government feared that this could have been the results of sabotage by Nazi spies or sympathizers, so they developed one of their more outlandish World War II initiatives. Dubbed Operation Underworld, it was an uneasy alliance with the Mafia in order to keep the docks safe, limit black market theft of valuable resources, and prevent labor strikes. Luciano went along with the whole thing in exchange for early release, but things did not go exactly as he planned. He got out of prison in 1946, but the US government deported him back to Italy. For Costello, things stayed more or less the same during the war. He was still the acting boss of the Luciano crime family, while his cousin, Willie Moretti, served as his underboss. But his life was about to become a lot more complicated and dangerous as he faced two new threats, both from the government and from inside the mafia. Luciano and Costello always managed to maintain an amicable relationship, but the same could not be said for the third man at the top of their crime family hierarchy, Vito Genovese. As we previously mentioned, Genovese briefly became the new head of the family when Luciano went to jail, but he then had to flee to Italy. During the war, Genovese befriended the fascists in order to make his life easier, allegedly even orchestrating a few hits in America on their behalf. When the tide turned, Genovese switched sides, but things did not work out so well this time. He was arrested by the US military police in Italy for running a smuggling ring, and then it was discovered that he was a fugitive wanted for murder in America. In 1945, Genovese was sent back to New York to stand trial. However, the case against him soon fell apart after two witnesses were killed, and so the charges were dropped. In 1946, Vito Genovese was again a free man, and he wanted to reclaim power of the Luciano crime family, except that Frank Costello was now at the head of the table, and unsurprisingly, he was not interested in giving up his seat. The first episode in this new power struggle occurred in December of that same year. There were a lot of important matters to discuss, and since Luciano was unable to return to America, he organized a meeting in Cuba. The Havana Conference, as it came to be known, was a landmark moment in the history of the American Mafia, where all the important mobsters got together to discuss the most pressing issues of the day. Last time they did this, they ended the Castelnuovese War and formed the Commission. Allegedly, Genovese arrived a few days early in Cuba and had a private meeting with Luciano, who had become aware of his former underboss's growing ambitions. At this point, Genovese was not openly feuding with Costello and Luciano yet, since he was not strong enough to win. However, he did have altercations over rackets and territory with Albert Anastasia, and suggested to Luciano that maybe it was time to get rid of Anastasia as he was too violent and unstable. He had a point. Also known as the Mad Hatter and Lord High Executioner, Albert Anastasia was one of the most ruthless mobsters in the Mafia's history, and definitely a future target for Biographics, by the way. However, that is not why Genovese wanted him out of the picture. Anastasia was the former boss of Murder Incorporated, and now was the head of his own crime family. He was loyal to Luciano and a powerful ally to Costello back in the States. Genovese's second point was far less subtle. He suggested that maybe it was time for Luciano to retire, since he could not return to America, and to cede control of the family to him. Unsurprisingly, Luciano did not take well to either suggestion. During the meeting itself, he reaffirmed his position as chairman of the commission and thus the de facto leader of the mafia, and then he also made Genovese and Anastasia shake hands in front of the other mobsters to prevent another Castelnuovese war. As for Costello, he was right there next to Luciano and would continue to serve as the acting boss of the family back in New York. Unfortunately for Luciano, the American government found out that he had left Italy and traveled to Cuba. He blamed Genovese for this, believing that he had tipped off the authorities. According to his later biography, Luciano had Vito come to his room, where he gave him a beating and broke 3 of his ribs, leaving him bedridden for 3 days. Facing intense pressure from the American government, Cuba eventually arrested and deported Luciano back to Italy, where he spent the remainder of his life under much stricter surveillance. The next time he traveled back to the United States, he did so in a coffin. Although Lucky Luciano was still in charge, the fact that he was in Italy severely damaged his influence. It was inevitable that other mobsters would start to feel like his time was over, and Genovese wasn't the only one in this situation. His most powerful ally was Carlo Gambino, who was gunning for Anastasia's position, while Vito wanted what Costello had. To make matters even worse, in 1951, Costello also had to contend with the first major investigation into the American Mafia. Officially, it had a very long and boring name, but everyone referred to it as the Kefauver hearings, after Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver. This was the man who chaired the committee and helped launch the investigation. Over 600 witnesses were called to testify, including prominent members such as Mayor Lansky, Mickey Cohen, and Tony Accardo, although the picture of Frank Costello before the committee became the most famous, iconic image associated with the hearings. Of course, people didn't have to settle for just images, as most of the hearings were televised and gained some of the highest ratings ever, giving most of the American public their first exposure to the mafia. Although the investigation obviously did not stop the mob, it led to several reforms and the creation of multiple federal and state squads that dealt with organized crime. It also got the FBI to finally admit that the National Crime Syndicate existed, but overall, after the hearings were over, the mob was still as powerful as ever. Frank Costello was among the most affected by the Kefauver hearings. He refused to answer many questions during his testimony, at one point walked out on the committee.
I'm not going to answer another question. You just says I'm not under arrest and I'm going to walk out.
He was charged with contempt and sentenced to 18 months in prison. Then he had another 5 years added for tax evasion, and although he was sometimes out on bail or pending an appeal, Costello spent most of the first half of the 50s behind bars. Costello's incarceration presented a great opportunity for Vito Genovese to try and force his way back to the top of the family. He wouldn't make a direct move against Costello. That would have been too brazen. But he started out by dealing with his allies. First was Willie Moretti, Costello's underboss and the man who controlled a lot of the family's muscle. Moretti suffered from the advanced stages of syphilis, and this greatly impacted his mental faculties. He had a tendency to ramble incoherently, and Genovese persuaded the other bosses that this turned him into a liability. He proclaimed Moretti's sentence to be a mercy killing, although it certainly did not look like one. On October 4th, 1951, Moretti was having lunch at Joe's Elbow Room in New Jersey with 4 associates. Unidentified gunmen entered the restaurant and shot Moretti repeatedly in the head and face before making their escape. Moretti's death was a heavy blow for Costello, and things got worse in 1956 when another key ally, Joe Adonis, voluntarily moved back to Italy instead of serving a lengthy jail sentence in America. When Costello was out of prison, he found his position considerably weakened. It was weak enough that Genovese decided it was finally time to take him out. On May 2nd, 1957, Costello was headed towards his apartment in Manhattan. He had entered the lobby, unaware that a large stranger was waiting for him behind a pillar. Costello heard somebody shout, "This is for you, Frank." He turned around just as the stranger pulled the trigger and shot him in the head before making his getaway in a black Cadillac. His would-be assassin did not realize that the bullet only grazed his head and just left a superficial wound. Frank Costello was still alive for now, but he realized that if it happened once, it was going to happen again. Just a few months later, there was also a hit on his final ally, Albert Anastasia, except this one was far more successful. On October 25th, the Mad Hatter was at the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel, relaxing in the barber's chair with a towel on his head. 2 gunmen entered the shop and shot him 10 times. Afterwards, Carlo Gambino became the new head of the family, renaming it after himself. The writing was on the wall for Costello. His allies were dead. Luciano could only watch what happened helplessly from Italy. He had lost the war with Vito Genovese. It was just a matter of how he would finish it. His saving grace was the fact that he stuck to the strict code of silence or omerta and refused to cooperate with the police. Ostensibly, his shooter was identified as Vincent the Chin Gigante, an enforcer and future family boss who was obviously working on Genovese's orders. However, in court, Costello refused to identify him, saying that he had never seen that man in his life. Gigante was acquitted, and Genovese became the new head of the family, renaming it after him and adopting the moniker Don Vito. However, for keeping quiet, Costello was allowed to retire, even keeping his legitimate businesses and some of his gambling operations as a source of revenue. In the movies, this would surely be a fake-out, allowing Costello to let his guard down before another hit takes him out permanently. But that didn't happen in real life. Once he agreed to Don Vito's terms, there were no more attempts on his life, and ultimately, Genovese did not get to enjoy his new position of power for long, although, well, that's a story for another day. Even though he wasn't a boss anymore, Costello still had plenty of respect and influence. He was the Prime Minister after all, and all the connections and favors he collected over a lifetime still proved to be useful to the other mobsters who turned to him for assistance. Costello remained involved with the Mafia one way or another until his death, which came following a heart attack in 1973. At the age of 82. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, please do check out our fantastic sponsor, Ground News, link below. And thank you for watching.